The confirmed COVID-19 cases have risen by 213, bringing the aggregate total so far to 33,016. We mourn the 5 lives lost over the last 24 hours, as we indeed mourn the lives of all those who have passed on as a result of this pandemic. Amid this tragedy, we are also remarkably thankful to God that we have, over the same period of 24 hours, recorded 241 recoveries, bringing our total number of recoveries to 19,296. So, fellow Kenyans, while we note the good progress that we have made so far in fighting this enemy, we must also acknowledge that this positive news is not a license for us to drop guard and backslide from our path of responsibility. Indeed, as I have mentioned in the past, we are fighting a war against an invisible enemy, and as we enter the 6th month of this war, we are also entering into a phase that is now being commonly referred to as the fog of war. In this phase, the combat arena is foggy. And in this fog war, the first instinct is that of self-preservation. You fight to propagate yourself, your family, and the environment that nurtures you. And in this foggy state, you also become aware that the government cannot police the daily activity nor the morality of every single individual citizen. In fact, in the fog of war, citizens, while maintaining their liberties, scramble first for survival. In sum, what will save us all in the war is exercise of civic responsibility. And I must emphasize here again that there are no unbearable responsibilities. In the face of a crisis like COVID-19, there are no unbearable responsibilities. And fellow Kenyans, let me make it clear when I talk about responsibility. I do not mean by responsibility who carries the burden, because responsibility is not a burden. It is a civic duty. Instead of seeing it as something you carry, we must seek it as a task, and a joyous one at that. It is a happy debt you pay to your fellow citizens for being a member of their community. The price you pay to propagate yourselves, your family, and your country. Fellow Kenyans, although we have done well in our attempt to flatten the curve, there are still 2 major challenges that have continued to stifle our efforts. First, while our determination to manage the spread of this pandemic in cities like Nairobi and Mombasa have started to pay visible dividends, this crisis has, however, begun to percolate to the counties. The new frontier of this invisible enemy is increasingly shifting to the counties and to our rural areas. Whereas there is no doubt that notable expansion of the health sector architecture has taken place in the counties, and for this I want to thank you, Governor Oparanya, and your colleagues. More needs to be done, and the pace of this expansion should be increased in order to cope with the gradual shift of this pandemic to the counties. So therefore, dear friends, given this challenge, but also the need for us going forward to anchor universal health coverage in the expanding health architecture, I today direct as follows. And the first is that the Cabinet Secretary for Health, acting jointly with the Chairperson of the Council of Governors, shall constitute a national reference group on COVID-19 to review the efficacy of our response to this pandemic so far. The group should record lessons learned and feed them back into the sector nationally, but also in the counties. The group should also formulate strategies to identify our institutional weaknesses within our healthcare system at both tiers, both national but also county, and recommend also ways to increase the representation of county governments in the boards of healthcare agencies, and recommend ways in which our national responses to healthcare emergencies can be improved. The same national reference group on COVID-19 should position healthcare as a driver also to our manufacturing sector and our agenda by ensuring that preference is given to local manufacturers in the procurement of pharmaceuticals and non-pharmaceutical products, not just for this pandemic, but also taking into cognizance our universal health care agenda. The National Reference Group on COVID-19 should also expand their ongoing work and establish the Kenya COVID Vaccine Consortium so that our research institutions, which are already doing great work, can now come together, bringing on board all relevant stakeholders locally, but also partnering with those internationally, and together sharpen their focus on the development as well as the testing of COVID-19 vaccines locally here in Kenya and for our region. Next, following the allegations of impropriety at the Kenya Medical Supplies Authority, better known as KEMSA, the relevant investigative agencies of our country are currently fully seized with the matter. However, given the compelling public interest on the matter, the relevant agencies should expedite their ongoing investigations and conclude the same within 21 days from the date hereof. Fellow Kenyans, in line with my stated public policy on zero tolerance to corruption, I want to once again reiterate that all persons found to be prima facie culpable as a result of those ongoing investigations should be brought to book, notwithstanding their public office or their political, and for that matter, their social status. Fellow Kenyans, the pandemic before us poses an individual crisis. It poses a health crisis, but it also poses an economic crisis. If the cure for this crisis is civic responsibility, and indeed, I do believe we have and are doing well in that area, there are some good returns as well from our economic sector. While this pandemic continues to present us with various unprecedented challenges, we must also always remember that Kenya is a work in progress. And that is why, even as we face the challenges before us, we must also celebrate the good returns, even as we continue to battle the challenges before us. Since March of this year, I have given 10 addresses over the COVID-19 pandemic, and today marks the 11th one. And in the 10 addresses, I have made certain directives to cushion our economy and enhance the purchasing power of our people. The most notable one is the tax cuts that we announced at the very beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. Those tax cuts have put a total of 47.8 billion shillings in the pockets of Kenyans. This, added to the additional 14 billion shillings of VAT refunds that I directed in the same month of March. We have in addition ensured that tens of thousands of Kenyans in need have also had access to direct intervention through weekly cash transfers to them and their families to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society are able to overcome and withstand this crisis. Added to this, we have the hundreds of thousands of Kenyans currently engaged in our kazi mtaani. Again, engaging and meaningfully engaging our young people in civic duty and responsibility across the length and breadth of our country. Indeed, reviewing the results today, I must admit that we have done much better than we expected. For instance, even under COVID, our economy is growing at 4.6% compared to 5.5% at the same time last year. When we look at our inflation numbers, they are lower today, standing at 4.4% compared to 6.3% during the same period last year. The current economic indicators, without doubt, are lower, but definitely far better than we ever anticipated. But the inspiring success amongst us, more than the numbers I'm quoting, have been those who have used the COVID crisis to reimagine their conditions. Our banking sector, for instance, has begun to retool and to humanize their model as a result of our meetings at the initial stages of this pandemic. And instead of focusing on profits alone, they are re-engineering their model to focus more on their customers. Government institutions, for example, the Kenya Revenue Authority, have also remodeled their approach. As an example also, instead of destroying 1.5 million liters of illicit ethanol that was in their custody, working together with other government agencies like Kenya Pipeline and many others, they converted that illicit ethanol into hand sanitizers that were distributed freely throughout the length and breadth of our country. But those aside, the most inspiring story of reimagining your circumstance during this COVID crisis is from a proprietor of one of the big private schools that unfortunately was forced to close. In order to meet his commitments and obligations to banks and suppliers, Juan Joseph Koho turned his school temporarily into a farm, rearing chickens and producing food. Our exporters too are retooling and turning this unfortunate challenge into promise. For example, many expected that the thousands and thousands of Kenyans employed in our floriculture and horticulture industry would collapse. But instead, through various interventions, we have seen our horticultural sector earnings jump to Kenya shillings 81 billion between January and June 2020, compared to 76 billion for a similar period last year. Earnings from Kenyan fruits alone nearly doubled from Kenya shillings 7 billion to 12 billion. What these examples of retooling businesses in times of crisis teaches us is that a crisis represents both a danger but also an opportunity. And those who horrify themselves with danger, unfortunately, will not survive. But those who choose to exploit the opportunities presented by the crisis become the new heroes of the moment. We have seen young men and women across the breadth of our country engineer making ventilators, making beds for our hospitals. These, without doubt, are the heroes of the moment. Fellow Kenyans, in order to secure the achievements that we have made so far and to build on them in the future, I now today, once again, further order and direct as follows. 1. The Cabinet Secretary for Interior Coordination of National Government, in conjunction with the Chairperson of the Council of Governors, shall in 3 weeks convene an inclusive national consultative conference to review our national and county COVID-19 response so far and together with all stakeholders, we chart Kenya's post-COVID future, because this is a future that we can see if we continue with our civic responsibility. Number two, the closure of bars and nightclubs shall continue for a further 30 days. However, the prohibition against the sale of alcohol by licensed hotels with residents is today vacated. In the next 30 days, I have also directed that the Ministry of Health, in conjunction with all bar owners, will develop self-regulating mechanisms as part of their civic responsibility to their clientele in order to allow their resumption. 3, that the closing time for restaurants and eateries be and is hereby varied by 1 hour from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. effective the 27th of August, 2020. 4, in accordance with the recommendations of the Interfaith Council, the maximum numbers of persons permitted to attend funerals and weddings is reviewed upwards from 15 to 100, with all in attendance abiding with the Ministry of Health protocols. 5, that the ban on the sale of second-hand clothing, otherwise known in Kenya as mitumba, is herewith lifted, and details of how this will be operated and the protocols for the same will be announced by the government tomorrow. 6, that the Ministry of Sports, Culture and Heritage and the Ministry of Health will jointly issue guidelines on the gradual resumption of sporting events in Kenya. 7, that the nationwide curfew that is currently enforced between the hours of 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. daily be and is hereby extended by a further 30 days. Fellow Kenyans, in concluding my remarks today, let me take this opportunity to say something about our Constitution. Tomorrow, the 27th of August, 2020, will mark the 10th year since we promulgated our new Constitution. This Constitution has been hailed the world over as one of the most progressive, not only in our region or the African continent, but the world over. And this is because it is an embodiment of what a social contract between people of different origins and their governments should be. But I must remind us all of one thing. If our past is constantly at war with our present, we will, together, lose our future. And the spirit of this Constitution was meant to reconcile our past with the present in order to secure our future. But the crafters of this social contract also told us and reminded us that a constitution was a work in progress. And as such, we were made to adopt it with a promise that in the future, we will make it better. 10 years later, the moment to improve on it, I believe, is now. And as I said in my Madaraka Day speech, we must not, as a people, succumb to the paralysis of constitutional rigidity. We must treat a constitution as a living being, as a living document that must constantly adjust to our emerging realities. In our past, all our constitutions have been what we may call ceasefire documents, agreements created to either dodge confrontation or avoid civil conflict. And indeed, if you do a textual reading of these constitutions, they represent a constant argument between the past and the present. And that is why I call them ceasefire documents. But 10 years after one of the most progressive constitutions, I believe the moment calls on us to do better. Instead of a ceasefire document that enforces a zero-sum game in which winner takes all and loser is expected to accept, the moment calls us to a new time. The moment calls us to create a constitutional order that will long endure and survive and not be a conflict-stopping constitution, but rather a future-building document. And on this, I want to emphasize to all of us that we must not go down a path of populism today, but let us choose a bold path, a path that will assure each and every Kenyan, regardless of where they come from, their social background, their ethnic background, their religious background, assure every Kenyan of sustained peace, security, and shared economic responsibility. Finally, fellow Kenyans, if we view our health crisis indeed first and foremost as a health crisis, but also switch our view and ask ourselves that this can also be looked at not just as a danger, but an opportunity, I do believe that we can completely rearrange our country. And we have seen it in the various new ways even we as government are reorganizing ourselves, in the manner in which this crisis has forced us to focus on the most disadvantaged in our country, in the health clinics that we are building in our informal settlements, in the roads that we are building in our informal settlements where the majority of our people live, in the opportunities through Kazi Mtaani and many other government programs that we intend to initiate to support our young people, in the manner in which we are also reorganizing our government to take advantage of digital technology in the performance of our work and in our outreach. I do believe we can rearrange our country. I do believe that it is possible and that our constitutional architecture can be not a conflict resolution document, but a document that lays the architecture of our future heritage. And indeed, as Abraham Lincoln once said, the only way a people or a nation can predict the future is to invent it themselves. We can invent together that future, and we want to do so through our actions of civic responsibility today. May God bless you all. May God continue to bless this great Republic of Kenya. Asanteni sana, twashukuru. Wageni wanataka kusema kitu? Your Grace, is there anything you may wish to add?
Thank you very much.
Nyinyi nimesoma kwa niaba yenu. Yeah. So asanteni sana, Mungu awabariki, tumeshukuru. Na nimesema baada ya wiki 3 tutakuwa na mkutano mkubwa ambao utahusisha wawekadau wote, county governments, serikali kuu, makanisa, mamisikiti na maimams wetu, wafanyi biashara, civil society, na wale wote ambao wana nia njema kwa taifa lao la Kenya, kujadiliana yale ambaye tumeweza kutekeleza wakati huu mgumu wa COVID, na pamoja tupange yale ambaye tutatekeleza baada ya hii jangwa kutupita, na kujua ni kwa njia gani pamoja tutajiinua na tusongeshe taifa letu mbele. Na hiyo ndiyo jukumu letu. Na mimi nasema kwa wote, serikali yangu na msimamo wake uko, na sitabanduka ama kupinduka. Tumesema njia ya kuhakikisha ya kwamba tumeunda nchi ambaye itastahimili miaka na miaka na miaka baada sisi wengine kuwa tumewacha dunia hii, ni kuhakikisha ya kwamba tutatenda yale yote ambaye ni ya haki. Na hayo haitafanywa kwa maneno duni ya siasa ya kujijenga leo, yatatendwa na vitendo. Vitendo vya serikali zote mbili, serikali kuu na serikali zetu za mashinani, yale ambayo yatatendwa na viongozi wetu wa makanisa, yale ambayo yatatendwa na wakulima wetu. Maneno matupu haijengi taifa. Vitendo ndivyo vitaamua Kenya ya kesho itakuwaje. Wakenya tushirikiane, tupendane, tushikane, tuache chuki, tuache kutumia siasa kama mpira wapata nipotee. Tunataka sisi wote tupate. Tunataka sisi zote tuishi kwa amani. Tunataka sisi zote tuishi kwa umoja. Tukipigana na ufisadi, tupigane na ufisadi, na tupigane kwa njia haki. Na tukifanya hivyo, matokeo ya yale ambaye tutafanya kwa vitendo vyetu ndivyo vitahakikisha ya kwamba tuko na nchi ambaye sio sisi ambao tuko leo, lakini hata vizazi vijavyo vitasherehekea kusema ya kwamba tuliwaachia msingi wa taifa ya furaha na busara. Mungu awabariki na Mungu aendelee kuilinda taifa letu la Kenya. Asante sana.
Was President Uhuru Kenyatta from State House making his 11th address since COVID-19 hit the country, giving us the update in terms of the restrictions as well as the numbers, which I'll begin with first.